Today we are talking about a man named Charles Kwabena Ebo Quansah. Now, if you've heard of this name, you know that this is Ghana's first serial killer. But if you've never heard of this name, then you would like to stay with me because this story is as bizarre as any other true crime story you have never heard. My name is Nix and welcome to the Nix Podcast. All we do here is to tell true crime stories all over Ghana and other parts of Africa. If something like this interests you, why don't you subscribe to the channel and give this video a like? Let's build a family together. This is going to be a very long one, so sit back and let me tell you a story. Now, let me start by telling you a little bit about who Charles Kwabena Ebo Quansah was. You know, many people who knew him back in the 80s and in the 90s, they just called him Papa. He was born in 1964 in Komenda, which is in the central region of Ghana, but he didn't stay there. By the time he reached his early 20s, he had moved all the way from central region to the capital. He was staying in Dansoman and he was trying to make a living for himself just like everybody else. But the thing is, even at that young age, he was already showing very disturbing behaviors. I'm talking about his records from 1986, and it is really frustrating to see how early the violence actually started. He was only 22 years old when he committed his first documented rape. I mean, this act was so vicious, it was so brutal that I cannot explain it here, but all I can say is that the police caught him and the court sentenced him to 9 months of hard labor. So because of that sentence, he was sent to James Fort Prison in Jamestown. Now you have to understand the state of James Fort back then. It is an old colonial building right on the coast, and at that time, it was famous for being extremely overcrowded and having very, very harsh conditions. Like, it was the kind of place that was supposed to break even the hardest of criminals. So you would think that, okay, doing 9 months of hard labor in a place like James Fort would actually make a young man stop and think about his life. But with Charles Quansah, it clearly didn't do anything to change who he was. In fact, it didn't touch him at all. So fast forward, he finished those 9 months in James Fort and he was released back onto the street. But listen to this. Just 3 months later, only 90 days after he was released from prison, he was arrested again for the exact same thing that sent him to James Fort at the first place. He found another woman and raped her. This was in 1987. So when the investigators questioned him this second time, he wasn't sorry or even bothered. I mean, the guy was so nonchalant. The police records actually say that he was very dismissive. He just deflected every question and denied that he was responsible for anything. It is really strange to me that someone could spend nearly a year in a tough place like James Fort and then go right back to the same behavior almost immediately. This showed a very clear pattern of what the police would call recidivism. I mean, this is just a fancy word, but all it means is that he was a repeat offender. He would be arrested, he would go back, do the same thing, arrested, go back, do the same thing without stopping. He had no intention of stopping. So because he committed the same crime again so quickly, the court decided that, hey, we are not having this anymore. This guy is a bad boy. He is a very, very bad boy. So the court gave him 3-year sentence and sent him straight to Unsolved prison. Now, Unsolved is about 40 kilometers away from Accra, and it is the main maximum prison of the country. Now, while he was serving those 3 years between 1987 and 1990, something happened that changed the direction of his life. He didn't just sit in the cell, he enrolled in a vocational training program to learn a trade. And this is where he met a man named William Bitar. Now, Bitar was a Lebanese national who was also an inmate at Unsolved at the time, and he happened to be a very skilled carpenter. I mean, the guy was very good at woodworks. And for some reason, he decided to take Charles Quansah under his wing. He taught him everything about carpentry and woodworking. And this relationship between Bita and Charles was actually a very big deal for Charles because it gave him a professional skill that he could use as a cover once he got out of prison. When he was finally released from Nsawam in 1990, Charles didn't stay in Accra. He had all these negative reports from Accra. The police and everybody knew him as a repeat offender. He was a rapist and all that. So he wanted a clean sheet. So he decided to move to Kumasi in the Ashanti region of Ghana to start all over. And when he got there, William Bita actually helped him out by arranging a job for him as a carpenter at a lumber yard. I am not too sure if Bita was still in prison by then, but since he was able to arrange a job for Charles, I suppose he was out of prison. So for about 6 years in the early 90s, Charles was living as a free man in Kumasi. He was working as a mechanic and a carpenter, just an ordinary looking guy earning a living. Nobody cares. But the thing is, this is the period where the violence in his life turned from sexual assault to actual murder. Now, let's shift our attention to a woman named Akua Serwaa. Akua Serwaa is a very important character in this story, and I would want you to keep her name in mind. She was only 24 years old, and she worked as a hairdresser in Kumasi. On the night of January 19, 1996, she was seen out with Charles. They were at a drinking spot near the Kumasi Sports Stadium, and witnesses described it as a drinking spree that lasted for several hours. These two were in for the booze. They were cracking bottles all over the place. So it felt like the two of them were acquainted with each other. So the next day, which was January 20th, a watchman at the stadium was doing his normal rounds. He was checking on a new kiosk that was actually built near the stadium grounds. And while he was walking near some bushes by that kiosk, he found something that would change his life forever. It was the body of Akua Serwaa. She had been strangled to death. Now, this guy was panicked. He didn't know what to do. So he quickly called the police, and the police started digging and found that she had been at her boyfriend's restaurant earlier that evening before heading to the bar with Charles. So when the police brought Charles in for questioning, he did exactly what he had done back in 1987. The guy just denied everything. He told the police officers that he didn't know who Akua Serwaa was. Now, you and I know that was a complete blatant lie because witnesses had seen them together for hours at a bar. Someone who was in for the booze, witnesses could never mistake them. But here is the place where the system really failed. You see, in 1996, the police in Kumasi treated this as just an isolated murder. They didn't have computers or a central database like we have today. They had no easy way to check his past records in Accra, so they didn't know they were dealing with a man who had already been to prison twice for rape. And because they didn't have enough direct evidence to charge him for Akua's murder, they just had to let him go. He just walked out of the prison a free man. And it is not just Akua. Around that same time in Kumasi, there were 3 other women who were attacked, but luckily for them, they managed to survive. One of them said that Charles started strangling her, but he ran away because he heard someone else coming. And another woman also said that she actually fought him off. And a third one escaped because a bystander appeared at the right moment. I'm telling you, these stories are so important because they prove he wasn't some kind of a juju or spirit something or an unstoppable force. He was just a man who was an opportunist, and he fled the moment he thought he might be caught. So even though he got away with that murder in Kumasi, he couldn't stay away from the police for long. Later that same year, in 1996, he was arrested again, but this time it was for robbery. He was sent back to Nsawam for a short sentence. While he was back in prison for that robbery, the police actually had a file on him that noted his aggressive behavior towards women. They knew he was a repeat sexual offender and even suspected him in the Kumasi murder. Yet there was no system in place to track him or watch him. In the mid-90s, the Ghana Police Service was struggling with zero resources. I mean, we have to say that, there was no such thing as a post-release supervision or police officers to check in on people like him. So when he finished that short robbery sentence, he just walked out the gate, and again, without anyone watching where he was going, he was a free man. So by the late 1996, Charles decided that he had stayed in Kumasi for long and he had to move back to Accra. Now, by the time 1998 arrived, the atmosphere in Accra was already starting to shift in a very different way. You have to understand that the country was going through some very difficult times back then. We were dealing with all these big economic changes, and many families were really feeling the heat. So because of that, a lot of women had to find ways to make extra money. And usually that meant they are participating in what I call the informal night economy. I'm talking about the women selling fried fish and kinky by the roadsides, the petty traders, the prostitutes, excuse me to say, and the sisters working late in the drinking bars. They had to stay out until the very late hours because that was when the workers were coming home and looking for something to eat or a place to sit down and relax. It was a very busy, vibrant nightlife, but it was also creating a situation where these women were walking into a trap they couldn't see. And while all this was happening, Charles Kwabena was already settled in Adenta. He was working his trade as a mechanic and as a carpenter, as we know, perfectly positioned to move through the city without anyone suspecting a thing. Now, before we even look at the first murder of this period, I want us to think about the state of the Ghana Police Service at that time. You see, in 1998, our police had absolutely zero forensic DNA capability. If they went to a crime scene and found a strand of hair or any kind of biological fluid, they had no way to test it or to see who it belonged to. They were working with their bare hands, so to speak. But even more than the lack of technology, there was a major problem with how the police were organized. Everything was done on paper and kept in local stations. If a murder happened in Dansoman and another one happened in Kaneshie, the officers in these two places were not talking to each other. They didn't have a central computer system to see that the same type of crime was happening in a different place. So because of this, they were treating every death as an isolated incident. Maybe a robbery gone wrong or a local dispute, instead of seeing the bigger picture and connecting these crimes together. The pattern officially started to show itself on April 25th, 1998. This was the day the body of a woman named Adwa Laria was found in Kaneshie. Now, Adwa was not just a random person. She had deep roots in her community. Her mother was Esi Chumwa from Kwashiman, and her father, Kwesi, a rapper, had passed away some time before. When the police arrived at that scene, what they found was truly disturbing, and it should have made everyone realize that something very different was happening. She had been strangled to death using her own clothing, but it was the way the killer left her that was really the mark of the monster. She was lying on her back in what the police call the supine position with her legs drawn wide apart. He had stripped her from the waist down and even inserted a foreign object into her body. It was a very deliberate sexual display meant to humiliate even after she was gone. The investigators found unused condoms scattered all around the body, and her shoes were neatly arranged right next to her. Now, let's think about this for a second. If a person kills someone in a panic, they run away immediately. But if you are taking the time to line up a victim's footwear neatly beside them, you open their legs nicely. You are calm, you are very comfortable, you are enjoying the power you have in that moment, and you are not worried at all about being caught. This showed a level of psychological confidence that is absolutely disturbing. So the police opened a file for Adjoa, but because they weren't looking for a serial killer, they just saw it as one singular violent act. And I'm telling you, the murders didn't stop there, because August and October of 1998, the heat started to pick up. On August 20th, they found the body of Akua Serwaa in Dansoman. Now, if you remember what we talked about before, Dansoman was the exact same place where Quansah had committed his first documented rape back in 1986. It was like he was returning to a neighborhood where he felt powerful and knew all the corners. On that same day, another unidentified woman was found murdered in the same way. Then about a month later, another victim was found in Sacramento. Now, these bodies were starting to appear in different suburbs, but because the police stations were like stones that didn't talk to each other, the alarm wasn't being sounded the way it should have been. In October of 1998, the violence hit a very young victim. Her name was Gifty Annan, and she was only 19 years old. She was a local girl from Latebiokoshi who lived with her grandmother, Mrs. Anna Annan, in Abosiokain. Her mother had already passed away and her father was living abroad. So she was young. She was a woman trying to make her way. She was found on October 17th and her death really shook the neighborhood. Then on October 30th, another woman named Beatrice Nedulate was found in the area they called Russia. Her husband, George Guma, had to go and identify her. By the end of 1998, 10 women were dead. Grace Amwa, Mary Lako Lakai, Adjoa Tre, and Akua Mate, and other unidentified bodies. 10 families were destroyed in just 1 year, and yet the police were still failing to see the pattern that was staring at them in the face. You see, because these bodies were found in such humiliating and strange positions, and because the police were not ready to give the public an answer, the public started looking for answers themselves. Now, everybody started talking about these juju and ritual murders. People were convinced that a syndicate of rich men were killing these women to use their body parts for magic so they could get more money or power. This idea of ritual murder is something that is very common in our conversations when we can't explain why something terrible is happening. This talk became so rampant, and instead of the police to focus on their investigation, this talk of juju became a massive distraction to them. It made the police start looking for big men in tinted cars or secret occult groups instead of looking for a regular man, a mechanic who lived in Adenta and moved around in trotros just like everyone else. Charles Kwabena was not even hiding in a hole somewhere. He was out every night. He was a regular at the local bars and the blue kiosk in neighborhoods like Mataheko and Dansoman. His strategy was very simple but very effective. He was a social person, very friendly, and he would approach women in these public spaces. He would buy them drinks, have long conversations, as we said, and he would build this little bit of rapport so they would feel safe. Then when it was time to leave, he would offer to walk them home. Because he was a carpenter and a mechanic, he had a lot of physical strength in his hands and arms. And if he wanted to attack you, he would attack you. And you can never get out of his hands. And that is what Quansah did. He would overpower his victims quickly before they could even scream for help. And he would use his hands to strangle them to death. In 1999 alone, 15 more women were murdered. That is more than one woman every single month. We have Beatrice Gadase, who was just 29. We have Mariama Chana, who was only 20. Ama Ampofoa, who was 22. And we have Araba Kwansima, she was 34. There was also a Comfort Boafu, who was 43. and Patience Awa Ohiefe, who was 30. Even a 55-year-old woman named Comfort Labi Manko Henaku was taken. I mean, the victims weren't just one age or one type of people. The range went from teenagers to even a grandmother. The only thing they all had in common was that they were women who were out in the evening, often working to support their children, and never came home. Now, when we entered the year 2000, the city of Accra was living under this heavy cloud that just wouldn't lift. For 2 good years, women had been showing up dead in the same terrible way, and it felt like the police were just running in circles. You have to understand the level of fear. People were literally looking over their shoulders every time they walked past the dark space. Poor street lighting was even a major problem that worsened the fear. But what made the year 2000 even more intense was that it was a major election year. And in our country, elections are always a high-pressure time. But this one was different. It felt like the safety of our mothers and our sisters had become the biggest political issue in Ghana. The thing is, the government at the time, the NDC under President Jerry John Rawlings, was in a very tight corner. I mean, they had been in power for a very long time, but now people were openly angry. The citizens felt like the government was failing at its most basic job, which is keeping people safe in their neighborhood. It got so serious that the Ministry of Interior was actually summoned to appear before Parliament. They had to stand there and try to explain why, with all the police and all the resources that they had, they couldn't catch one man. They talked about new security measures and increased patrols in places like Mataheko and Dansoman, but the talk didn't match the reality on the ground. While the politicians were arguing in the chamber, the bodies were still appearing in the bushes. And this is where the political transition really starts to matter for this story. The opposition party, the NPP led by John Ejekum Kufuor, saw exactly what was happening. They realized that the Mataheko murders were a symbol of a government that had lost its grip on the law and order. So Kufuor and his team made this a central part of their campaign. They were going from town to town, from city to city, promising the people that if they were elected, they would finally solve the mystery of the Accra Strangler. They promised a zero-tolerance approach to crime. For the average woman in Accra who was afraid to go to work at night, that was a very powerful message. It made the murders more than just a police case. They became the primary reason many people were crying for a change in government. But even with all this political heat and the extra eyes on the streets, the killing spree actually reached its peak in 2000. It's like the killer didn't care about the elections or the extra police at all. In that year alone, 8 more women were added to the official list of victims. We have Akosua Obriwa Mensah, we have Fafa Avediva, we have the Charity Akosua Apreku, and there were also at least 3 other women found that year who were never even identified, and they were buried as jindos. Each time a new body was found, the scene was the same. The victim will be strangled, often left with her clothes from her waist down being removed and posed in the same disturbing sexual way, with her legs being opened, as if somebody had just done something with her. And I wonder if he does that before killing them, or he kills them first before having sexual intercourse. But in either ways, it was like the killer was mocking the authorities. He was saying that no matter who you vote for, I am still here. Now, let me tell you about a very strange event that happened in June of 2000, because it really confused the whole situation. On June 26th, a woman named Augustina Efia Efrie, everyone called her Tina, she was found murdered inside of her own house. Now, this was a bit of a shift because the other victims were usually dumped outside. But the police actually moved fast and caught a man named Mauli for this crime. When they questioned him, Mauli confessed to killing Tina. But here is the part that is really interesting. He said he did it for ritual purposes. He admitted that he had deliberately copied the way the Accra Strangler killed his victims. He used the same strangulation method and posed the body in the same way that he did to confuse the police. Now, when you think about it, this copycat crime by Mauli was like a petrol on fire. The public was already convinced that these were ritual murders, and people were already talking about juju and secret societies every single day. So when Mauli was caught and said he was doing rituals, it made everyone think that, okay, we were right all along. It made the investigators' job almost impossible because now they didn't know if they were looking for one serial killer or if they were looking for 100 ritual murderers. It showed you just how much the strangler's pattern had entered the public mind. Even other criminals were using his signature to hide their own work. It was a very confusing time for the police, and it allowed the real killer to keep moving in the middle of all of that noise. Now, while the city was focused on rituals and the election, something very important was happening in the Adenta and Medina area. Actually, this is where the center of the killings shifted. In the previous years, the bodies were mostly in the west and the central parts of Accra, like Dansoman and Mataheko. But in 2000, Charles Kwabena was living in Adenta, and because he was there, the murders started appearing there too. Around the middle of the year, some records say February, others say July, Quansah's own girlfriend, a woman named Joyce Boating, was found strangled in her home. The police actually arrested Charles Kwabena for Joyce Boating's murder. They had him. He was in a cell. But they treated it as a simple domestic violence case. They thought it was just a man who had fights with his girlfriend and it went too far. Because they weren't sharing files between the different police stations, the officers in Adenta didn't look at the way Joyce was strangled and realize it matched the other 30 women who had died across the city. Even though Quabena was being watched for his girlfriend's death, he was still able to go about his businesses. And that leads us to the most critical murder of the entire 8-year spree. This was the case of Millicent Maunya Adeku. It happened in December of 2000, right when the election tension was at its highest point. Millicent was a married woman, actually, and on the evening of December 10th, she went to a drinking bar in Adenta. Now, the bar was owned by one of her relatives, so it was a place where she felt safe and people knew her. While she was there, she ran into Quabena. From what we know now, Quabena approached her and started asking her for sex. But Millicent wasn't interested. I'm telling you, she was very firm with this guy. She told him clearly, hey, I am not interested in anything that you are talking about. I am a married woman. Stop your advances. And according to what Quabena allegedly said later, he felt insulted by her refusal. He claimed that he became possessed by an evil spirit because of that insult. So Millicent left the bar that night to go home, but unfortunately, she never made it. The next morning, December 11th, her body was found behind a house on Pawpaw Street in Adenta. The scene was exactly what the police had been seeing for years: strangulation, sexual assault, and the body was posed face up with the legs wide apart. There were condoms all over the place, with foreign objects inserted inside of her. When the police processed the scene on Pawpaw Street, they noticed that Millicent's t-shirt was missing. In almost every other murder, the killer would leave the victim's clothes nearby or just leave them half naked. But with Millicent, her top was gone. This missing t-shirt is what we call the Chekhov's gun in storytelling. It's a small detail that appears now but becomes the most important thing later. So just keep that missing t-shirt in mind. Now, let's look at the timing of Millicent's murder. She was found on December 11th, and that was exactly 4 days after the first round of the presidential elections on December 7th. The country was in a state of total suspense because no party had won with an outright majority yet. The whole nation was waiting for the runoff. They were waiting for the runoff election on December 28th. Then out of nowhere, the news about another woman found strangled on Popo Street hit the public like a thunderbolt. It felt like the final proof that the NDC government had completely lost control. People were saying that even during elections, this man, Jerry John Rawlings, is still killing us to stay in power. Like the pressure on the police was just too much. And by the time the runoff election happened on December 28th, the public had made up its mind. They were tired of the NDC, so John Agyekum Kufuor and the NPP won a historic victory, ending the 19 years of Rawlings' era. I'm telling you, the Mataheko murders played a huge role in that result. It definitely might not be the same for the other 9 regions at the time, but for Accra, people voted the NDC out solely because of these deaths. January 2001 was a very heavy time for our country, but also a time where people were feeling a tiny bit of hope. You see, John Agyekum Kufuor had just been inaugurated as president, and the atmosphere in Accra was kind of optimistic. We had a new government, a new direction, and a leader who had stood before the people and promised to bring an end to the nightmare of the Accra Strangler. But you have to understand the massive weight that was sitting on the president's shoulders. He wasn't just inheriting a heavily burdened economy or a broken political system. He was also inheriting a capital city where women were terrified to go to the market after 6 p.m. He had made a campaign promise to catch the killer. And now that he was in the Osu Castle, the people were waiting to see if he could actually deliver on that word. They actually had Charles Kwabena in custody since February of 2001, but they didn't really know what they had. You remember the police picked him up for the murder of his girlfriend, but let him go because of lack of evidence. The police in Adenta didn't sit down quietly. They actually did some digging and they picked him up again for the murder of his girlfriend, Jess Boating, and they were also looking at him for the 1996 killing of Akua Serwaa in Kumasi. Then something very unusual happened in April of 2001 that changed the whole direction of the case. The director of the FBI at the time, a man named Louis Freire, was on his way to South Africa for an important meeting. And after the meeting, he decided to make a stop in Accra. Now, this was a historic moment because an FBI director had never visited Ghana before. While he was in the city, he met with President Kufuor, and the president didn't waste any time at all. He sat Freire down and said, look, we have this terrible issue in our capital. There are so many deaths going up and down. We have about 34 women who had been found strangled and posed in death in very bad positions. He admitted that our local police were overwhelmed and that they needed specialized help to break the case. When Louis Freire heard what the president spoke about, he promised the president right there and then that he would have a team of experts on the ground in Accra within 10 days. And of course, the FBI is the FBI. They kept that promise. So by late April, a 7-member team landed at Kotoka International Airport. They were some of the best investigators in the world at the time. The team was led by a man named Gerald Downs. Everyone called him Jerry, who was a very experienced special agent. He brought in 4 agents from the behavioral analysis unit in Quantico, and these are the people who specialize in the psychology of serial killers and child abductors. He also brought 2 forensic experts from the evidence response team in Washington, D.C., and a polygraph expert from Atlanta. When they arrived at the CID headquarters in Ghana, they didn't just take over the case. They started working side by side with our local officers. They saw right away that the Ghanaian investigators were hardworking. They were very hardworking, but they had 0 resources. There was almost no physical evidence saved from the crime scenes of these previous 3 years. It was a very difficult situation to walk into. However, there was one very important piece of evidence that had been preserved. When the police searched Charles Quansah's house in Adenta back in February, you remember, like, they went back to search his house because they were watching him for the killing of his girlfriend, Joyce Boating. The police found a bloody t-shirt. Now, remember what I told you about Millicent Manya Adeku? She was the woman who was killed in December 2000, who was found without her t-shirt. That missing t-shirt was the one the police found in Quansah's room. At the time, the local police knew it was suspicious, yes, but they couldn't prove that it belonged to the victim or that the blood on the shirt was that of Millicent. But when the FBI arrived, they saw the value in that shirt immediately. So they took the piece of clothing and sent it all the way back to their lab in Quantico, Virginia, to do something that had never been done in a Ghanaian criminal case before: a full DNA analysis. While they were waiting for the lab results, Jerry Downs and his team introduced some very clever techniques. One of the first things that they did was to create what they call a pin map of Accra. Like, they literally took a physical map of Accra and started pinning down every single location where a body had been found over the last few years. This is part of geographic profiling. When you look at a map like that, the patterns start to show clearly. You see, the murders weren't just random all over the place. They were happening in very specific clusters. You have one in Adenta, then one in Dansoman, then you have one in Mataheko, then you have one in Kaneshi, like all these places. And by looking at these clusters, the FBI could tell that the killer was likely living or working in these zones. It showed them that the person they were looking for was someone who knew these neighborhoods like the back of his hands. After they saw the clusters on the map, the FBI taught the local police how to do a systematic neighborhood canvassing. This isn't like some high-tech stuff. It's old-fashioned. It's this door-to-door police work. So they went to houses and businesses near the dump sites and started talking to everybody. The FBI agents didn't even mention Charles Quansah's name to the people they were interviewing. They just asked if anyone had seen anything strange or anything suspicious around the time of the murders. In the first 4 neighborhoods, the name Charles Kwabena came up over and over again. The people who didn't know each other were all saying the same thing. They had seen this mechanic named Charles working with women or hanging around the areas where the bodies were later found. And this was the major breakthrough the country had been waiting for. All the low-tech door-to-door knocking was pointing straight at the man who was already sitting in a cell for his girlfriend's murder. Now, around this same time, 2 men named Al-Hassan Mohammed and C.K. Dromo came towards to claim the reward. The government had put a 50 million old Ghana cedi reward on the table, which was a massive life-changing amount at that time in 2001. Now, that's what we call 5,000 cedis today, but to adjust for inflation, that will likely be about 50,000 to 60,000 cedis today. These informants said they were the ones who originally told the police about Quansah's aggressive behavior back in February. There was a bit of a debate about whether it was the informants or the FBI's canvassing that really cracked the case. But the truth is, both things were now pointing to the same person. The investigators finally knew that the man they had in custody for 1 or 2 murders was likely the monster who had killed dozens. So by the first week of May 2001, the FBI and the Ghana police were ready to really sit down and interrogate Quansah. These sessions were held at the CID headquarters, and I'm telling you, they were very intense. You had these American agents and the Ghanaian officers, and because Quansah mostly spoke Fanti, they had to have an interpreter for every single question. It was a slow, high-tension process. The FBI used some specific psychological tactics on him. They noticed that Quansah had a very big ego. So instead of just shouting at him, "Hey, why did you do this? Why did you do that? Blah, blah, blah," they looked at him and started telling him, "Look, my guy, you are going to be famous. You are going to be known as the first real serial killer in the history of Ghana, and that is something to be proud of. Can you confess to us that you are really the one who did this? Like they were licking his brain. They were playing on his need for attention to get him to open up. And then they brought in the polygraph machine. This was a huge moment in our police history because a lie detector had never been used in a case like this before. In fact, we had never had such a case until now, and our police had never seen a lie detector machine. Maybe they have, but we have never used it before in any case that Ghana had ever seen. So the experts from Atlanta hooked Quansah up with the machine and started asking him questions about the murders in Dansoman and Mataheko. Even with the language barrier and the translation, the machine was showing that Quansah was being deceptive. He was lying through his teeth, and the machine was catching every bit of it. Once Charles Kwabena saw that he couldn't beat the machine, the pressure in the room went up. The investigators kept pushing. They were telling him that they already knew the truth. They knew he was the killer and that it was better for him to just come out clean and confess. Then, on May 8, 2001, Charles Kwabena finally broke. He sat in that room and officially recorded a confession. Now listen to the scale of what he admitted to. He confessed to 9 murders in total. He admitted to killing 4 women in Kumasi, including Akua Serwaa, and 5 women in Dansoman, Adenta, and Mataheko. He was very specific about it. He described what the victims were wearing, where he had met them, and exactly how he had strangled them. He even told the investigators about the last things the women said to him, how they begged for their lives before he took them. Like, it was very chilling. The confession was very disturbing. But there was a very strange moment during the interrogation that caused a lot of talk later. Quansah was getting frustrated with the constant questioning. There was a grueling process that lasted for days. And at one point, he allegedly snapped out of pure sarcasm or perhaps frustration. Then he shouted at the interrogators. He said, "Yes, I've killed 90 women. Leave me alone. Why do you keep asking me so many questions? Keep asking me the same thing over and over again. If you want me to confess, yes, I've killed 90 women." Now, if you think about it, 90 is an impossible number for that time. And it sounds like a man who was just tired of being yelled at. Officially, they had confirmed that the women who were killed were 34, but Charles was saying that he had killed 90. So the police took that statement and used it to show the scale of his crime, even though they only had evidence to charge him for the 9 that he specifically described. To make sure the confession was real, the police did something they called the crime scene corroboration. They put Quansah in a car and drove him around to a different spot in Accra, in different places in Kumasi where the bodies had been found. They didn't tell him where to go. They just told him to point out the places where he had left the victims. And according to the official records, he was able to lead them directly to the dump sites. He showed them exactly where the bodies were lying and how he had posed them. He was identifying locations and body positions that matched the old crime scene photos perfectly. And then while all of this was happening, the smoking gun finally arrived from America. The DNA results from the FBI lab in Quantico came back and they were undeniable. They found that the blood on the t-shirts from Quansah's house was a perfect match for Millicent Adeki. But that wasn't all. They also found Charles Kwabena own DNA on that same shirt. This was the first time forensic DNA had ever been used to link a suspect to a serial murder in Ghana. Now, while he was in custody, a psychiatrist named Dr. Samuel Ohene was brought in to see if Quansah was actually sane. Now, this part is very interesting because Quansah tried to explain his actions using a lot of supernatural and cultural reasons. He told the doctor that he had abnormal reactions after drinking alcohol or eating cat meat. He claimed that eating cat meat made him violent and that he was possessed by an evil spirit that forced him to kill. He said the spirit just took over his body and everything he did was just out of his control. But Dr. Ohini evaluated him very carefully and found that he was completely rational and coherent. This man was not mad. This man knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't having delusions. He knew exactly what he was doing was wrong, yet he kept doing it. He was fit to stand trial, and his spirit excuse was seen as just a way to avoid responsibility. Actually, the most disturbing thing Quansah said to the psychiatrist was a very cryptic warning. He told Dr. Ohini, "I am not the only person killing Ghanaian women." Now, you have to think about what that means. Was he trying to say that he had accomplices, or was he just trying to say that violence against women was a bigger problem? By the end of May 2001, the FBI team was ready to head back to the United States. They had done exactly what Louis Freire promised President Kufuor. They had brought in a new technology. They had helped identify the suspects through old-fashioned door-to-door knocking, and they had provided the DNA evidence needed to build a solid case. So by the time 2002 arrived, the whole of Ghana was holding its breath. For over a year, Charles Quansah had been sitting in a cell, and it was like the people of Accra were finally starting to sleep a bit better. But the real climax was just about to happen in the courtroom. Now, I want you to imagine the scene at the High Court in Accra. This wasn't just any trial. This was the trial of the man everyone believed was the most prolific killer our country had ever seen. People were crowded all over the court premises, and the tensions were so thick you could actually touch it. But when you look at how it actually started, it was a very messy and a very disorganized situation, honestly. You know, the thing is, when Charles Quansah first made his appearance in court, he was just standing there all by himself. He told the judge, "Hey, look, I have no money, I have no legal counsel to defend me. And in our legal system, if you are facing a murder charge, you must have a lawyer. It's the law." So the court had to step in and order the legal aid board to find him a lawyer. So they assigned him a man named Joseph Amui to represent him. But I am forced to feel for Joseph Amui in that very moment. He was an under-resourced lawyer from the legal aid, and he was being asked to defend the most hated man in the country with almost no support and no budget. It was a very heavy burden for one man to carry, and the pressure from the public was just unbelievable. I'm telling you, like back then, the media was just having a field day with this case. It was a total circus. People were actually selling calendars on the streets with Quansah's face on them. Street hawkers were making profit off the face of a suspected serial killer while his trial was going on. And on top of that, people were calling into the local FM stations and they were launching personal attacks against the lawyer, Mr. Amu. They were insulting him for doing his job, and why was he defending a man that the country termed as the monster? Why was he trying to defend somebody who has killed about 34 people? I mean, it was so bad. It was so bad that Justice Agnes Dodgy actually had to suspend the proceedings in May 2002. She said that the media interference was making it impossible to have a fair trial, and that the public hysteria was poisoning the jury pool. She had to hit the pause button. "Hey, we are not doing this anymore. Let the public calm down, then we continue." So now, when the trial finally started properly on July 11th of 2002, the prosecution did something very strategic that a lot of people didn't understand accessed. You see, the police had linked Quansah to about 34 murders, right, in Accra. But the principal state attorney, Anthony Jambibi, didn't charge him for the Accra murders. Instead, he chose to prosecute him for only one murder, that 1996 killing of Akua Serwaa in Kumasi. This was what people call the Al Capone strategy. The prosecution knew that the Accra cases were complicated, and they relied on a confession that Quansah himself was trying to take back. But the Kumasi case from 1996 was a cold case where they had actual eyewitnesses who could place Quansah with the victim. They figured it was better to get one guaranteed conviction and a death sentence rather than risking a long, messy trial for 34 deaths that might actually fall apart. So the trial focused on that hairdressing sister from Kumasi, Akua Serwaa. The prosecution brought in her sister, who identified the body, and Akua's boyfriend, who owned a restaurant, to talk about her last movement. They even brought in witnesses from a local bar near the Kumasi Sports Stadium. These witnesses testified that they saw Quansah and Akua on a drinking spree together for hours on the night she died. Then they brought in that watchman who found the body the next morning in some bushes near a newly built kiosk. The evidence was all about putting Quansah at that specific spot at that specific time in 1996. It was a very focused case. It was meant to show the jury that, hey, this man here had a history of being with women just before they were strangled. Now, when it was the defense turn, the whole tone of the trial changed. Charles Quansah took the stand, and people who were there said he was very confident but quiet. He didn't look like a man who was shaking with fear. He just looked very calm. He actually pleaded not guilty, and he made a statement that became very famous in the newspapers. He said, "I had not murdered even a bird." I mean, the irony of that. I had not murdered even a bird. He denied knowing who Akua Serwaa was, even though the witnesses from the bar said they saw them together. He told the court that he was just a simple mechanic, a carpenter, and that the police were just trying to use him as a scapegoat because the public was crying for blood. They were crying for an answer, and then the police had to give them the answers, so they tried to use him as a scapegoat. You know, like the core of Quansah's defense was that his confession was not real. The defense lawyer, Mr. Amri, he started a very big legal battle over the evidence. He filed a motion asking the court to subpoena the police. He wanted them to bring the FBI's polygraph machine that they used to test him, the actual records of that lie detector, and also the audio and video tapes of the confession the police claimed Charles Quansah made. He wanted to show the jury that Quansah was being forced. So the court ordered the police to provide those evidence before a set date. The police simply did not bring the evidence. They claimed that the FBI had taken the polygraph machine and all the test results back to the United States. They didn't produce any tapes, no video, no confession. They basically told the court that, hey, look, we don't have it. We don't have any of the evidence or any of the documents that the defense is asking for, and that was the end of it. And you know what happened next? Justice Agnes Dodgy actually allowed the trial to continue without the evidences that are being asked for. She didn't punish the police for ignoring the court order, and she didn't throw out the confessions as well. Nobody in the jury saw the confession. She just allowed the police officers to stand in the box and tell the jury what Quansah confessed to, even though the physical proof of that confession was missing. The defense was arguing that this was a huge procedural failure, but the judge overruled them, so the jury was left with the word of the police against the word of a man who everyone already believed was a monster. It was a very difficult position for the defense to be in, especially when they were so underfunded. And when the time came for the jury to decide, the whole country was waiting. There were 7 members of the jury, and they went into a room to talk about everything they had heard over those 10 days of testimony. They came back into the courtroom with a unanimous verdict of 7-0. All 7 members of the jury found Charles Quansah guilty of the murder of Akua Serwaa. The moment that verdict was read, the courtroom went totally silent, and Justice Dodgy didn't waste any time at all. In our law back then, if you were found guilty of murder, there was only one sentence the judge could give. So the judge sentenced Charles Quansah to death by hanging. Now, once the judge handed down that death sentence in 2002, most people in Accra thought that was the end of the matter. We all figured Charles Quansah would just go to his own prison, sit there in his cell, and just wait for the hangman to come for him. The city actually started to move on, and the newspaper stopped putting his face on the front page every single day. But the thing is, even though the court said the case was closed, the story was actually just entering a very strange and very political phase. The real trouble started in June of 2003, right around the anniversary of the June 4th uprising. Now, you know how the significance of June 4th is in our history. It's a day the NDC party takes very seriously because of former President Jerry John Rawlings. Well, on that day, Rawlings stood up in front of a big crowd and dropped a bombshell that shook the whole country to its core. He didn't just talk about the past. He looked straight at the sitting NPP government under President Kufuor and made a very heavy accusation. He alleged that 15 cabinet members in the Kufuor administration were actually the ones involved in the serial murders of those 34 women. And when a former president like Jerry John Rawlings says something like that, people don't just ignore it. He was basically saying that the government had used a serial killer to destabilize the country or for some other dark purposes. He challenged President Kufuor. He also challenged Nana Akufo-Addo, who was the Attorney General at that time, and also challenged Jake Obechebi-Lampe to go with him to a place called Antoanyama. In our culture, especially in the Ashanti region, Antoanyama is a very powerful and very feared river deity. Swearing an oath to a god like that is not a joke at all. People believe that if you swear an oath to Antwa and you are lying, the gods will strike you down almost immediately. And Rawlings said he was ready to swear his own innocence, and he wanted the NPP ministers to do the same to prove they weren't involved in the killings. He even demanded that an independent investigator should give him and the ministers a lie detector test. It was a massive challenge that put the whole government on the defensive. Of course, the police and the government didn't take this lightly. Actually, it turned into a very big standoff. On June 12, 2003, investigators from the CID went straight to Rawlings' office to interview him. They wanted him to give them the names of those 15 ministers he was talking about. But the thing is, Rawlings refused to name anybody. He told the officers that he would only cooperate if the government agreed to his demand for independent lie detector tests administered by someone outside the country. So the CID director, David Asante Apiutu, was not happy about this at all. He put out a public statement dismissing everything Rawlings said. He argued that the police already had their man, and he pointed back to the FBI's work in 2001 as the proof. He said that because Quansah had failed his polygraph and also because they found Millicent Adeku's t-shirt in his house, there was no reason to go looking for ministers or swearing oaths to any river gods. While the politicians were busy arguing about Antoanyama and cabinet ministers, Charles Quansah himself decided to break his silence from inside of Insaon prison. In August of 2003, a newspaper called the Ghana Palaver, they published a story where Charles Quansah completely took back his confession. Now, you have to understand how big of a deal this was. For 2 years, the police had been telling us that he admitted to the crime voluntarily. But now, Quansah was saying that the confession was a total lie. He claimed that he only signed those papers because the police had put him through absolute hell during his interrogation. He started describing the torture methods that are honestly very difficult to hear about, let alone imagine someone going through that. Quansah alleged that the police investigators were using very brutal, old-fashioned ways to break him. He said they would keep him blindfolded and handcuffed for days on end. So he didn't even know if it was day or if it was night. He didn't know who was torturing him, but it got much worse than just being tied up. He claimed that the officers used hot pressing irons to burn his skin. Can you imagine the pain of a hot iron being pressed onto your body until you say what the police want to hear? He also said that they gave him electric shocks and they beat him so severely that blood started pouring out of his ears. He told the newspaper that he wasn't confessing because he was guilty. He was confessing because he wanted the pain to stop before they killed him. He actually had the physical proof on his body. His lawyer, Joseph Amri, went on the record and said he had seen the scars himself. He described them as being very consistent with the kind of torture Quansah was talking about. The burn marks and the deep scars from beatings. And later on, when journalists were allowed to visit him, Quansah would point to these marks on his skin and tell them exactly which officer did which injury. This created a very big problem for the official story. If the famous serial killer in Ghana had visible torture scars, it made the people wonder if everything the police said in court was actually true. And Quansah didn't just stop at the torture allegations, though. He started telling a very detailed story about why the police wanted him to confess. He called himself a pawn in a much larger game. He claimed that during his interrogation, a senior officer named Superintendent Issa tried to get him to lie for political reasons. Quansah alleged that Issa told him, look, if you implicate President Rawlings and his wife and say that they hired you to kill those women, we will make this whole thing very easy for you. If the police could get a confession linking the former president to a serial killer, it would have politically destroyed the NDC party forever. But Quansah said he refused to do it. He told the officer that he didn't even know the Rawlings family and that lying about them would be a blot on his conscience for the rest of his life. But then, he said, the pressure started coming from the other side too. He claimed that another officer, who he identified as Inspector Onipa, tried to get him to name someone from the NPP government. He alleged that they told him if he named a very senior member of the Kufuor administration, he might even be let off lightly. He said they specifically tried to get him to name the vice president, Aliyu Mahama. But Quansah's response to that was just blunt. He said he told the inspector, I don't even know who Aliyu Mahama is. So, if you believe what Quansah was saying from death row, then it looked like the police weren't even trying to solve the murders anymore. They were just trying to use him as a political weapon to throw mud at whoever was in power or whoever used to be in power. It became a matter of who you believed. If you were a supporter of the NDC, you looked at Rawlings' claims and Quansah's torture scars and you were convinced that the whole thing was a grand conspiracy to frame the former government. But if you were an NPP supporter, you looked at the fact that the murder stopped the moment Quansah was arrested, and you figured he was just a manipulative killer trying to use politics to avoid the hangman's noose. So the CID director, David Asante Apietu, tried to calm things down by saying that the FBI took photos of Quansah during his procession and he looked uninjured. But the thing is, those photos were taken during the administrative parts, like fingerprinting and all that. They don't prove what happened behind closed doors during the private interrogations. You know what I mean? A man can look fine for a photo at 2 p.m. and be beaten at 4 p.m. And then in September of 2007, things hit a whole new level when a radio station called Radio Gold aired what they called the secret tape. This was an interview with Quansah that had been recorded back in 2003, but had been held back for 4 years. They finally released it because some pro-government newspapers were reporting that Quansah's own relatives had admitted he was guilty. So Radio Gold wanted to show the other side of the story. And hearing Quansah's voice on that tape changed things for a lot of people. He didn't sound like a crazy person or a monster. He sounded very calm. He sounded very coherent. He went into deep detail about the torture he says he endured. He talked about the pain and then the pressure to frame politicians. Hearing a man describe how he was broken by pain, not guilt, in his own voice, made it much harder for the public to just ignore him. It made him a human being again instead of just a name in the headline or the monster that people tried to tag him with. And suddenly people were asking why the case was handled with so much secrecy and why so much evidence was missing. It made the whole solved case wahala of the Accra Strangler look very, very messed up. Actually, when you look at this whole situation today in 2026, it is quite a heavy thing to process. Charles Kwabena has spent more than a third of his life behind those walls in the eastern region. He is an old man now, about 62 years old, but if you go there today and talk to him, he will tell you the exact same thing he said back in 2001. He still says he had never killed a chicken in his life. And actually, something very interesting happened just recently that we have to talk about to understand his current situation before we end this story. So in July of 2023, our parliament voted to abolish the death penalty for ordinary crimes like murder. Now, you have to understand that even though Quansah was on death row for over 20 years, Ghana hasn't actually executed anyone since 1993. So the death penalty law was there, but nobody was using it. And because this change in the law took effect in 2023, Quansah's death sentence was officially commuted to a life imprisonment. So he's no longer living in that specific condemned state where you are waiting for a hangman or someone to decide when you are going to die, but he's still a man who is destined to die in prison anyways. Now let's look at what it would actually take to prove his guilt beyond any doubt for all those murders. I've been thinking about this a lot. To move from legally convicted to factually undeniable, you would need independent DNA verification for every single one of those 34 scenes. But here's the problem. The only DNA evidence that exists in this whole story is from Millicent Adeku. That's the t-shirt. And that was even tested at the FBI lab in Quantico, Virginia, way back in 2001. Now, you have to ask yourself, why was no other evidence from the other 30 crime scenes ever tested? There's no public record of a single hair or a drop of fluid from Dansoman or Mataheko being matched to Quansah. If we want to say he is the serial killer for the whole city, shouldn't there be a biological proof at more than just one house in Adenta? Without that, we are just guessing that it's the same man based on how the bodies were positioned. And then we have to talk about the confession because that is the foundation of the whole case. The police testified that Quansah confessed to 9 murders, but he has always disputed that. He even says that he only mentioned the number 90 because he was being sarcastic and he was frustrated during the beatings. But the real issue here is the chain of custody. There is no audio recording of this confession. There is no video. No defense attorney was even in the room when he signed that statement. And what about the polygraph? The police keep saying that he failed the lie detector test, but the FBI took the machine and the raw data charts back with them to America in May of 2001. And those records were never entered into the Ghanaian court archives. It's like the most important evidence is sitting in a black hole in the United States, and our own judges never even saw the raw data. How can we be sure of a confession that has no independent witnesses and no recording? Now, let's flip the coin and look at what it would actually take to prove he is actually innocent, though this is going to be a bit complicated. If Charles Quansah wanted to clear his name, he would need verifiable alibis. But think about the life he was living. He was a roadside mechanic and a carpenter. He didn't have an office where he clocked in and clocked out. He didn't have pay slips with no timestamps. For a man living that kind of informal life, trying to prove exactly where you were on a specific Tuesday night in 1998 is basically impossible, especially when you are being asked this question 25 years later. You know, the time problem alone makes it so that he can never truly prove he wasn't there. He is stuck in a position where he has to prove a negative, and the system isn't designed to help a poor mechanic to do that. But the part that really stays with me is the medical side of his torture claims. Quansah has visible scars all over his body. His lawyer saw them, and many journalists have seen them too. They look like burns and deep beatings. Now, a fellow inmate from 2001 even said they saw him returning to his cell looking bloodied and broken. Why was there no independent forensic medical exam done back then? If a doctor had examined him in May of 2001 and dated those scars, they could have proven if they happened during the interrogations, or maybe those scars had happened long before and he's trying to use them as an excuse. So now we just have these torture scars that the police say happened before his arrest, and Quansah says they happened during, and it's just another he said, she said situation that could have been solved with a simple medical report 30 years ago. And then there is the Maoli anomaly. I don't know if you remember, but on June 26, 2000, a woman named Augustina Ifia Ifrie, they called her Tina, was murdered. And the police actually caught a man named Maoli for it, if you remember. He confessed and said he did it for the ritual purposes. But the strange part is that the method was identical to the Accra Strangler signature. He strangled her and posed her body in that specific way. Now you have to think about this carefully. If Maoli was not Quansah, how did he know the exact signature? Was he a copycat who learned it from the newspapers, or was he actually an accomplice? Now Maoli's confession clearly mentioned rituals. If it was a ritual murder, then we have to talk about the contractor. You see, in our setting, if you say something is a ritual killing for power or for money, there is actually a big man behind it. It's someone paying the killer to get the result. The police investigation just stopped at Quansah. They didn't look at any financial trail, and they didn't even look for any big man. It's just like they were satisfied with catching the man holding the knife, or in this case, the hands, without ever asking who was paying for the juju. If there was a ritual syndicate, then the people who actually ordered those murders are still free, and they've been free for 25 years. That is a very disturbing thought to live with. Actually, the whole situation with the FBI reports is another thing that doesn't make sense. With Jerry Downs and his team, they did their work, and then, they went back to Quantico, and then they took the behavior profiles, and then they took their interrogation notes with them. I mean, all those things are just excuses. There is no public record of the Ghanaian government ever using our treaties with the US to subpoena those files. They never asked for them. And those notes probably contain the real details of what happened in those rooms, whether he was led by the questions or if he gave the info freely. But they are sitting in a jurisdictional confusion when the evidence is also sitting somewhere else. They exist in an archive in America, but they are invincible to our justice system here in Ghana. Why has no one asked for them? If the truth is in those files, why are we leaving them there? And also, when you look at the missing docket, it just adds to the feeling that the system wanted this case closed. I mean, in 2010, it came out that the official court docket for Quansah's case was just gone. It was missing from the archives, and his appeals lawyer hadn't been paid by the Legal Aid Board, so the whole process just stalled for the entire decade. How does a docket for the most famous serial killer in the history of the country just vanish from a high court? It makes you wonder if someone was trying to make sure that the case never got a proper review. When files go missing and lawyers aren't paid, it's the truth that suffers the most. Before I sign off, how many of you have actually not heard of this man? Just let me know in the comments, and if you have and there's something that I said that is really confusing, or maybe it contradicts what you've also heard, you can let me know in the comment section. And please, if you liked this true crime podcast, then don't leave without subscribing to my channel. I love you so much. You can call me next, you can call me MK, and thank you for showing up to the next podcast. See you in another one.